So let me show you quickly like how that actually played out for Nico in this case to sort of show you what this will look like. Let me see if this will play out here. Oops, let me stop share. So remember what I talked about before, where I had sort of this idea that I was sharing with you about Nico and how he had sort of, again, written a chapter in that way. Well, Nico was, had some challenges with how he was doing it here, but what was nice about it is that Nico inventoried the chapter. So key thing, remember, that he wanted to make the case in defining this chapter, that sort of his chapter 2, that marketers should be bold. That was the case he was making. And so the story that he puts his notes in there, lessons they want to have in it, thoughts, all those sorts of things. So whatever he wanted to do about it, his own experiences. Then he started to build his examples. So again, he has a story in there of a personal marketing story that happened to him. And so he just sort of laid that case out there and sort of said, okay, well, this is what happened to me when I was bold and why it worked. Then he laid out about the Sarah one. And so he'd written that one out there. At the time, he hadn't written away.com. He'd seen the story but hadn't written it. So he could just put in there, I need to write it. And then he started to put his backup down. So he saw in Seth Godin's book, Seth Godin talks about this idea, as well as some research from Cal Berkeley that talks about why entrepreneurs who are bolder wind up succeeding in that way. Now what this helps him do is sort of, again, get a sense of where he needs to write stuff, where he has holes in it, and sort of organize in that way. Now what we'll do next week, and I'll sort of give you a preview of it, is once you find a book that you really admire. So for example, Nico really liked how Seth Godin wrote. And so what you can sort of do then is once you've got an inventory of what you want, you can take that content and actually move it into a structure that other authors have used. So you'll see here is that what we'll show next week is this is how he actually built his chapter. So he's got a quote. He sort of got this idea of Sarah. He's got kind of his content here. He's got it organized in terms of how this book, Seth Godin, kind of organized his content around it. So now what you start to do is you move your content around. He leads out with this story. He leads out with this story here about why the Sarah G story, first part of it, then kind of some research about why being bold works, then he organizes the second part of Sarah, then his personal story, a couple lessons, a research story, some more research, a couple other personal stories, and then back to Sarah. So what we've done here is we take our content that we have and we organize it now into the structure of another chapter. So none of you should be writing chapters from scratch. You should be writing them based on books that we have. So we'll talk about this more next week, but that's sort of how we actually organize things a little bit. So I'll pause there for any kind of questions and comments folks have, but does the idea here of how we wind up doing sort of story inventories or sort of inventories make sense a little bit to you guys? I guess on the phone here, or anyone in person have any questions about how we sort of do this idea of doing inventories in these ways? Questions on it? So again, key thing to sort of think about here is as you start to look at the content you have and that you want, my recommendation is to sort of go from what we've sort of brainstormed in our positioning call, look at them and sort of say, great, I've got these sort of 12 or 15 arguments that I need to make. Now, based on what I have, how would I define the argument that I'm actually making there? Again, people who are sort of good at self-love wind up becoming better sort of at relationships, so these people value time. And so if Matt's making that argument, he's very clear. He says people who have high self-love value their time. That's the argument. That's sort of what he's defining it to be. And then he describes it in more detail. He adds examples from his own personal life, from the interviews he's done, and from the research that he's done. And then he backs that up about understanding it so we have depth behind it in that way. That's kind of what you want to do with each and every chapter. And then again, particularly as Audrey sort of asked, if she sort of wants to turn her content into more, sort of a chapter structure, start to write in this way. And again, you can start to organize chapters however you want. We'll talk next week a little bit more about how to actually do, and this will be a virtual session, but how to actually do chapter structuring using these sorts of things. But again, if you want to start to organize it, start to pull these things together, sort of pull all the content together, and we'll start to move it around in that way.